there's a lot of people finding homes, Pete. It's
been a busy weekend. Yeah,
yes.
It's been a busy weekend.
Yes, is it just because as the portal's about to close again, everybody's in the musical chairs mode, like, I got to make sure I find a place?
Yeah, I think that's a lot of it. And obviously athletes don't have to commit during that 15-day window, but guys want to make sure they lock down a spot, especially in this day and age with roster management and top recruits and things. You never know these days, right? And you hear so much about recruits maybe losing spots. Well, transfers are going to lose spots too if they don't lock up their decision sooner or later.
So Damien Martinez, the guy we've been talking about since even before this one opened, one of the bigger prizes, a very accomplished running back, was great at Oregon State last year. Obviously, a lot of things changed. Jonathan Smith goes to Michigan State. Aiden Childs, their quarterback, follows him to Michigan State. So Martinez entered the portal. He has now found a home. Where's he going, Pete?
He is going to be a Hurricane. He committed on Saturday to Miami. Damien Martinez didn't rush this process by any means. He took visits to Arizona and Mississippi State. He also called off visits to Tennessee and Kentucky. Miami went in home twice with him, Andy, and I think that made all the difference. The Canes were the team to beat from the beginning. Not much surprise in all of this, but from a football perspective, a huge pickup and what it does to that backfield and gives Cam Ward another weapon to work with.
Well, and Miami wasn't done this weekend because I've started the player of consequence alert for when, and we're going to use that in the spring portal. We don't need to use that in the winter portal because there's a lot of players of consequence in the winter portal. But in the spring portal, when you get a guy who enters the portal who clearly was in his current team's plans for the next year, that's the one you got to watch. Jalen Alderman at Louisville, a linebacker, was one of those guys. He entered the portal. He's joining Damien Martinez in Miami.
Yeah, so he committed on Sunday. And then another really big pickup for Miami on Sunday was the Houston wide receiver, Sam Brown, who started his career off at West Virginia and then went to Houston. Now he's going to go to Miami. He has a connection to that coaching staff. I believe he was with Shannon Dawson at one point. I think that Miami has become one of the go-to destinations in the spring window. And I say that because they have available roster spots, and I think a lot of athletes are really excited to play with Cam Ward.
Yeah, and this is a good roster. This was a pretty good roster already. And I think you add what they've added pieces where these are not guys who are necessarily going to be massive stars, but maybe Damien Martinez could be, but they are going to fill roles that needed to be filled. And Miami should have the depth they need. I still think with Miami, it's really not a matter of talent. It's a matter of, can Mario Cristobal do the right things on game day? Because I feel like they're equipped to compete with pretty much anybody on their schedule.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the roster, a lot of really good young talent. They brought in the wide receiver JoJo Trader, who should get some reps immediately. And I mean, you say it. I think back to the game last year and the exact team they played slips my mind.
Georgia Tech,
right? Georgia Tech, yeah, that Georgia Tech game and how they mismanaged the end of the fourth quarter. Like things like that can't happen in 2024. And you talk to anyone down there, and they're so confident about all the talent they have. So this is going to be a prove-it year for Mario Cristobal.
Yeah, I'm looking at that schedule, and they should be 9-3 at worst with that schedule. Because like Florida's a game they can win. I'm not going to hand it to them because I need to see them do it. Florida State's one that Florida State will be favored. Everywhere else, at Louisville, maybe not, but everywhere else they're going to be favored. And
there's like 3 or 4 games on there where I'm like, okay, like those are going to be interesting games to watch. But I mean, there's also should be a lot of wins on that schedule as well.
Yeah, that at Syracuse, after we had Fran Brown on the show, I'm in the bag for Syracuse this year.
I'm very in the bag for Syracuse. I'm also curious, right? At Louisville and then home against Florida State. Like that's a big 2-game stretch.
Yeah. So Willie in the chat. Willie, by the way, the guy who created the term Nakosifications, he's one of our favorite viewers. Says Miami went in home with a portal player and Colorado won't even go in home with a high school player. I guess in-home visits do work. Funny how Willie mentions Colorado because even though Deion Sanders not doing a lot of in-home visits and really probably couldn't do a ton right now because they were just finishing up spring practice this past weekend. They added quite a bit through the portal over the last few days. Rashad Amos, the running back from Miami of Ohio, who was originally going to Mississippi State. Zechariah Owens, the Clemson O-line transfer. Auburn DB Colton Hood, whose brother Brandon is a 24 recruit who also committed to Colorado. And Nakai Hill Green, he was one of the Biff Poggi Michigan to Charlotte guys. He was a captain at Charlotte last year. Now he's headed to Colorado.
Yeah, I think the last 2 weekends now for Colorado, this past weekend was a spring game, and they've done a really good job of getting guys out to Boulder. And I know Willie in the chat pointed out how they don't do the in-home visits. But obviously something's going right when they get the guys on campus in Boulder for the official visits out there with Deion. I really like the additions to the offensive and defensive line. You added Peyton Kirkland last weekend. You added Ray and Buell. You added a handful of guys who I think could actually like help Colorado in both lines. Kind of, I don't know. The Big 12 is going to be good this year, so it's going to be interesting to see how everything's handled. And when you think about Shedeur Sanders this past year, you think about all the sacks. Yeah, I mean, I know he could be a round one draft out in 2025, but it's hard to not think about that Colorado 2023 season and think about all the sacks.
Well, and here's my skepticism regarding Deion and the recruiting plan is it doesn't seem like they're planning much for the future, but you actually look at some like Zechariah Owens, and then you mentioned Peyton Kirkland from Texas. Those are offensive line with multiple years of eligibility. Zechariah Owens has 4 years of eligibility.
Yeah.
He redshirted at Clemson last year. So perhaps that's the plan. And there is a future plan going on to build an offensive line, to build a defensive line. But that's where my skepticism lies. But if you're going to do this, I can live with this. If you're going to bring in highly recruited offensive linemen who maybe didn't work out at their first school, or maybe they just wanted to change the scenery, and you have them for 3 or 4 years, that more resembles a plan than what we were seeing before.
And they have Jordan Seaton too, who's also a freshman.
Right.
So those
True
are
freshman,
three guys with a lot of eligibility. It's we're all kind of gearing up for this year, right? Like the last year, Travis Hunter, Shedeur, Shiloh, like should be very interesting to see how it plays out. My bigger question, as you were getting to, is like, okay, what does all of this look like at Colorado after this season? Yeah,
and that's, I think, and Deion addressed that. It was either in the post-spring game press conference or one late last week where he said, I know everybody thinks I'm leaving when Shedeur and Shiloh leave, but I'm not. So, okay, you got to show us that through how you plan for post Shedeur and Shiloh, because the thing is, like, Chris Kleiman is planning for however many years down the road at Kansas State, and you've got to deal with him in your conference. Lance Leipold is preparing for multiple years down the road, and that's the harder part. Speaking of Chris Kleiman and speaking of Colorado and Coach Prime, Dylan Edwards, the Colorado running back transfer, has found a home. He's going to Kansas State to reunite with his buddy Avery Johnson.
Yeah, Dylan Edwards was in Manhattan, Kansas all weekend, got there Friday night, spent all day Saturday and Sunday there, and then committed to the coaching staff Sunday at a brunch, from my understanding. I mean, what a huge pickup for Chris Kleiman. And Avery Johnson was his host for the weekend. It just added up at so many different levels. Really, really excited to see this backfield, right, with Avery and Dylan Edwards, but they already have experience there. And you get the feeling that Dylan Edwards could become a huge threat in the passing game.
Yeah. And the thing is, like, if only there were a history of short running backs being good at Kansas State. If they'd ever had a few that could have done something there, maybe we'd no. That's the thing. Like, when a guy like Dylan Edwards shows up with that power cat on his helmet, you're like, okay. We've seen this movie before. We know what happens here. But the other thing is DJ Giddens is back. So there's no pressure on Dylan Edwards to carry the running game. And let's be real here. Avery Johnson is going to be a massive part of the K-State running game this year. So P. Maximus with a really interesting question in the chat that I think you can probably address here, Pete. How do you feel about Amorian Walker supposedly returning back to Michigan as a wide receiver after transferring to Ole Miss. Remember, Maureen Walker was a corner who transferred from Michigan to Ole Miss in the winter portal.
Well, P. Maximus, I can answer your question saying that I have had sources tell me that he is expected to return to Michigan. I haven't been able to track down if it's a wide receiver or cornerback. I kind of get the feeling that they're open to doing both as long as he returns to the program. As a wide receiver, he was talented. I think a lot of people thought he had a lot of upside as a cornerback too. I don't really think it matters. It's either way, it's going to be a good get for Michigan to get Maureen Walker back on the roster.
We got to come up with a name for this, by the way, Pete. I was thinking about this morning because Caden Proctor's another example of this, from Alabama to Iowa, then back to Alabama, where you transfer back to your original school. There's a couple other guys this weekend that we heard might be doing that too. It's not a bounce back, because a bounce back is someone who kind of goes back home after, like a 5-star who grew up in Orlando, who went to a Big Ten school, but then transfers to UCF. That's a bounce back. Could this be a boomerang?
Oh, that is great, Andy. I was sitting here thinking of things, but I
don't think I can take credit for that. I think somebody else mentioned that on the show about a month ago.
Okay,
maybe it might have been Dukes. Might have been Philip Dukes. But
shout out to Dukes on that one. That's great.
Yeah, no, but it's got to be a boomerang. So
yeah, it has to be a boomerang.
So, Maureen Walker, congratulations to the newest boomerang if you wind up back in Ann Arbor. But one more, because I do want to get to an interesting kind of legislative topic in college football, because I always like talking realignment with you too. Yeah. Willie says it was Dukes the Scoop. So good. I'm glad I gave proper credit to the right person. So I'm surprised it wasn't Willie, because Willie's come up with a lot for this show already.
Our executive producer, Willie T.
Exactly. One more transfer question. So Nick Roush, our friend from Kentucky Sports Radio, reported over the weekend that Peny Boone, who is the 2023 MAC Offensive Player of the Year at Toledo, he'd initially planned to transfer to Louisville. Then he was going to look elsewhere. It looked like he was going to land at Kentucky. Nick reports that because of some sort of academic transfer issue, transferring credits, that he will not be able to transfer to Kentucky. So what happens to Peny Boone now?
Yeah, this has been something I've been monitoring for about 10 days now. And there was some real momentum that he was going to get into Kentucky. I haven't actually been formally involved. That Kentucky's off the table. But what I will tell you is that if he can't get into Kentucky, I think the same will go at some other schools across the country that he was eyeing. And I really can't tell you what's going to happen. I know that the way things ended at Louisville, I think there's a chance he could go back, but I can't tell you certainly that Louisville is going to be an option.
And we're going to see this for as long as this happens. And again, we don't know how long this system's going to be in place. But for as long as this happens, where guys can transfer as much as they want, you're going to see this academic piece come into play, because schools have rules about what they can take. And if you've been to multiple schools before, it probably gets even harder. And Peny Boone started at Maryland, went to Toledo. This would be school number, because he was at Louisville.
Yeah, he was at Louisville.
This would be school number 4
months. Yeah.
Yeah. So I imagine the registrar's office is going to have its say in quite a few of these things. So,
and I'll also say, I'm not an agent, I'm not an attorney. I would just tell athletes to make sure to check it out, because I'll tell you that programs that you're leaving are not going to go out of their way to make sure that you know that you're academically eligible or not.
Yeah. Yeah. They might not pick up your phone call at the registrar's office at your school that you're leaving. So you do have to be aware of that. Thank you so much for watching. Just a reminder, subscribe to this channel right here so you never miss an episode of Andy Staples On 3. And oh, by the way, watch all the other great videos on the On3 Sports YouTube channel.